Hello, everyone. Good afternoon and welcome to National Gallery Singapore. My name is Lucas and I'm one of the organizers of today's program. So this lecture, the original, the copy, and the remade, Artworks and Their Doubles by Professor Maurizio Peleggi, is proudly co-presented by National Gallery Singapore and Culture Academy Singapore. We're honored to have with us His Excellency Alistair Cox, High Commissioner of Australia to Singapore. Also in the audience are Dr. Eugene Tan, Chief Executive Officer and Director of National Gallery and Singapore Art Museum, as well as Mrs. Rosa Daniel, Dean of the Culture Academy Singapore. So we're thrilled to see this wonderful turnout, and thank you all for joining us. Professor Peleggi will speak for about 45 minutes or so before taking questions in a moderated Q&A. Professor Peleggi has been at the National University of Singapore since 1998, and in this time, he has taught quite literally a generation of historians, curators, and culture workers, such as myself, and I believe also several of you in the audience. So before Professor Peleggi takes the rostrum, we wanted to invite another ex-student of his to introduce him more fully. So it is my pleasure to invite up on stage Dr. Priya Jaradi, Senior Lecturer in the Department of History at NUS and the convener of its Art History program. Over to you, Priya.
His Excellency Alistair Cox, the Australian High Commissioner to Singapore, Dr. Eugene Tan, CEO, National Gallery Singapore and the Singapore Art Museum, Mrs. Rosa Daniel, Dean, Culture Academy, distinguished guests, artists, students, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Priya Jaradi from the Department of History at NUS, and today I have the honor to introduce my mentor and well-regarded cultural historian, Professor Maurizio Peleggi. I've known Professor Peleggi in the capacity of his supervisee and later as a colleague at the Department of History. What strikes me most is the discipline with which he approaches both facets of his career, his scholarship, and teaching. He morphs into a monk, meditating and writing about his next publication, not to be disturbed, and with equal ease, he transitions into a dynamic educator in the classroom. And I suppose this afternoon's talk serves as an ideal setting to listen to the scholar and highly engaged public speaker. Professor Peleggi's academic contributions need no introduction. Through significant monographs and journal articles, he has engaged Thai visual and material culture, the politics of heritage and museology in Southeast Asia, and global histories of images. His rigorous scholarship, always presented in a lucid and elegant writing style, has not only earned praise from peers worldwide, but has also made his scholarship extremely accessible at various levels, starting with the undergraduate student and curriculum. To this end, his contributions as an educator for the past 27 years at NUS deserve to be acknowledged. And to borrow partially from the previous introduction, if I may, Lucas, through his popular undergraduate courses, graduate seminars, and doctoral supervision, Professor Peleggi has trained, quite literally, a generation of historians, curators, cultural workers, and educators, many of whom are in the audience this afternoon. Among his more recent contributions, the undergraduate art history minor at NUS, which was originally mooted by Dr. Eugene Tan, and which of course continues to enjoy the partnership of the National Gallery Singapore and the Singapore Art Museum, was marshaled from ideation through to Senate approval over 2015 and 2016 by Professor Peleggi. Beyond the university, he has contributed to Singapore's museums in the capacity of an advisor and a reviewer of exhibitions. You will all agree, friends, that through this afternoon's talk, we have gathered to celebrate a fine scholar, a warm teacher, and a treasured friend, known for his impeccable sartorial sense, both on and off campus, and his unmatched wit and humor. Regardless of what Walter Benjamin thought, or what we are about to hear this afternoon, or even what OpenAI has to say, I remain convinced that this is the kind of aura, the Peleggi aura, that cannot be replicated. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Professor Maurizio Peleggi.
Well, first of all, thank you, Priya, for the nice words. And I'm not sure about the aura and the sartorial style, but everything else is true. I won't pretend a false modesty. And thank you to you all for being here this afternoon. This lecture has been 1 year in the making, and so it feels really good to finally be here on the podium this afternoon. Before I start, let me thank you, my host, NGS, and in particular his director, Eugene Tan, and Lucas Huang, who organized the event with Erika Lai, as well as the co-presenter of this event, the Cultural Academy, in the person of his dean, Rosa Daniel. In this talk, I draw on things that I've been reading and also writing in the past 5 to 6 years. I'm going to span East and West, ancient and contemporary, in a somewhat dizzy ride in the history of images. But it's also going to be a fairly dense talk, so this is the right moment to leave the theater if you are afraid. I begin, however, with words, precisely the words in the title of my talk that alludes, and I'm sure you guessed it, to the title of a famous spaghetti western by Sergio Leone. You guess which one? Huh? The good, the bad, and the ugly. Huh? The good being Clint Eastwood. The adjective originals come from origin, and on it is cast the word originality. Of course, they all share a common etymological root in the Latin verb oriri, to rise or begin, commence. As art historian Rosalind Krauss wrote in 1982, the theme of originality, encompassing as it does the notions of authenticity, originals, and origins, is the shared discursive practice of the museum, the art historian, and the maker of art. And throughout the 19th century, all of these institutions were concerted together to find the mark, the warrant, the certification of the original. End quote. This institutional certification accounts for the expectation that what we see in museums are original works, but for occasional curatorial lapses of judgment. Acknowledgement that lapses occur more frequently than one may think has, however, led institutions such as the British Museum and the National Gallery in London to organize show of copies and fakes that lay been disowned in their warehouses. If appreciation of the artistry of copies by curators and art historians has been somewhat belated, philosophers and semioticians have been seeking for a long time to ascertain the ontological and perceptual properties of copies versus originals, in the attempt to determine consistent conceptual criteria to operate a distinction. The lexical choices at our disposal indicate that copies come in many different forms. Forgeries are copies made with fraudulent intent. Then there are not malicious fakes, as well as replicas, facsimiles, duplicates, reproductions. This variety is well illustrated by the fashion industry commodities. Branded commodities show a gradation that goes from what we call the original or authentic item to crafty counterfeits, as well as cruder imitations, whose varying degrees of fidelity to the original places copies in a hierarchy of market value. This degree of fidelity depends on how the item's type, design, brand logo, and materials are each imitated and fused to produce a copy similar enough to the original commodity to exert a fetishistic appeal onto the consumer. Marx remarks in chapter 1 of Capital that even though the commodity appears to be something trivial, in fact, and these are Marx's words, it abounds in metaphysical subtleties and theological niceties. Fetishism is only secondarily about kinky sex. The ism word is custom fetish, the transposition of the term fetizo, by which 17th century Portuguese traders qualified objects like amulets and wood figurines that West African people seemingly treated as materialization of life forces, animated things. 19th century evolutionary anthropologists construed fetishism as the most primitive stage in the development of religion on a pair with animism. Marx, and later Freud, made it into a concept in their respective theories of economic value and psychic disorder. The analogy of artworks with commodities spurs my first proposition. The primary purpose of the copy is to substitute for an original that is remote or inaccessible. If we cannot hold or behold Van Gogh's sunflowers or sport a Gucci bag, beholding or owning a copy is the next best thing. This seems to be the limit, however, to which one can push this analogy, for artworks and fashion items are clearly different types of objects. This statement begs the question of what kind of object an artwork is. I shall adopt George Kubler's definition of the work of art as an object made for emotional experience from his overlooked 1962 book, The Shape of Time. Krauss, in the article I just mentioned, seems to follow Kluber when she stresses that feeling is the mark of the pictorial original. Indeed, museum surveys show that the public response to exhibits that are presented as copies is apathetic, meaning lacking in emotional response. Although ordinary viewers are generally unable to distinguish between copies and originals. Now, let's backtrack 4th century. In a 1582 treatise that validated art as a tool for the Counter-Reformation, the Italian cleric Gabriele Paleotti argued that images were first created as a remedy for what he called the defect of distance. The purpose of images, he writes, is to restore the damage we suffer for being far or separated from things. Ristorare il danno che si patisce per le cose lontane e separate da noi. Remote things we long for are not only objects and people that artists strove to portray mimetically, at least until the invention of photography. They also include the invisible and the intangible, such as good presence, as in Gian Lorenzo Bernini's naughty Baroque masterpiece, The Ecstasy of Saint Teresa, or the communion with the numinous in nature, as manifested in peaks and mountains, as this in almost contemporary scroll by Wang Shemin, whose entire oeuvre is a reinterpretation of the style of the 14th century master Huang Gongwang. 20th century art historians as diverse as Ernest Gombrich, David Summers, and Hans Belting too think that images originated as cultic substitutes for absent things or persons. And this person need not to be human necessarily. Art, in this perspective, begins only when substitutions, born out of funerary ritual where images substituted for the deceased in their voyage to the netherworld, gives way to naturalistic representation. It's in this sense that Belting, in his landmark 1919 study, Bild und Kult, that was translated in English as Likeness and Presence, the original title, of course, in German means image and cult. Belting speaks of the era before art. Now, there is a Eurocentrism to this thesis that we may discuss during question time. This famous statue of Octavian Augustus, Rome's fifth emperor, belongs to the era before art, but not because it's a commemorative monument in the secular sense or more banally a piece of propaganda as we may think anachronistically. It belongs to the era before art because it's an iconic image, highly idealized and replete with symbols about Augustus' purported divine genealogy. The statue was disseminated via copies across the empire, provinces, to promote the cult of Augustus that precluded to his posthumous apotheosis. So I formulate my second proposition. The copy is a substitute for a work of art that is, in most cases at least, itself the substitute for an unreachable object, physical and mental, or for an unreachable being, human and non-human. In order to successfully substitute for the work, the copy must elicit in the viewer the emotional response that is seen as the prerogative of the original work. This is Candedes by the Indonesian artist Jim Supangkat, one of the better known in the collection of NGS and also one of my favorites. It's an original insofar as it was made by or under the supervision of the artist himself. Yet it's not the original Candedes made in 1975 for the inaugural exhibition of the New Art Movement. What you see in NGS is the artist's replica made in 1996. In my mind, Candedes formed a pair with another work by an Italian artist associated with the late modernist movement of arte povera, Michelangelo Pistoletto. The work is called Venere degli Stracci, of Venus of Rags. There are at least 4 iterations of this work found in the collection of various galleries and museums. The Venus itself is, interesting enough, a replica not of a classical statue, but of a work by the neoclassical Danish sculptor Bertel Thorvaldsen. So here we have a number of Pistoletto reiterations of his own work, the central element of which is a copy of an early 19th century sculpture that itself imitates the ancient model of the Venus pudica. Last year, a gigantic version of Venere degli Stracci was installed in a piazza in Naples under the auspices of the municipal authority. A few days later, the Venus was set on fire by an arsonist, later discovered to be a homeless man. This is an image of the fire. Though saddened by the vandalization, the unflinching 91-year-old Pistoletto vowed to reinstall the Venus at his own expenses, as he has done, to reaffirm the idea that beauty is generative as well as regenerative. Of course, some commentators argue, and I tend to agree, that in fact, La Venere degli Stracci found in the bonfire the fulfillment of her destiny in a name. But what is exactly that went up in flames? Certainly not the 1967 work, not least because the size and the material of the gigantic Naples iteration were very different. Candedes and Venus of Rags are both works of conceptual art whose value lies more in the idea they convey than in the artistry and the sheer materiality. The work that paved the way for conceptual art, Marcel Duchamp's infamous Fountain of 1917, exists today only in multiple replicas made by Duchamp himself in the 50s and the 60s. Remade, ready-made, we may say, paraphrasing his famous brand name. In this particular case, where the work consists of a ceramic urinal, replication is about the artistic gesture of signing, by which any ordinary object can be transfigured into an art object. In this case, of course, the signature was itself part of the prank, moot being American slang for fool. Despite the initial rejection by gallerists, Duchamp's Fountain is now recognized as a milestone of 20th century art for adumbrating the hollowness of originality in late modernism and conversely celebrating the artist's power of transfiguration. Now, we need a separate discussion here to be devoted to Alfred Stieglitz's photograph, by which the no longer extant 1975 work continues to circulate as an avatar in almost every art book manual. But Fountain also raised the philosophical question of what distinguishes two indiscernible objects, one of which is considered an art object and the other instead an ordinary object of use. Is not Fountain, after all, the same ceramic urinal that is sold in a sanitary workshop? The question, as you may know, was addressed by Arthur Danto, an American philosopher. Danto answered that he qualifies as an art object that which is recognized as such by the discursive institutional commercial apparatus he famously called the art world. Moreover, once the ordinary object has achieved validation as a work of art, the remaking of his original self does not affect his authenticity. This is at least the case when the work is remade by artists themselves or with their supervision and approval, as the three examples I just shown. But the recent fad for the recreation of late modernist works, exhibition, and even performances, which I take to be the obvious symbol of a creative crisis, also include the work of dead artists. This is Robert Smithson's installation Dead Tree, featuring a 40-feet scavenged tree, which was discarded as per the artist's instruction at the end of his only exhibition at the Düsseldorf Kunsthalle in 1969. This work has been recreated 3 times since 1997 in a Brooklyn gallery, Oslo Museum, and at the 2015 Venice Biennale. In the meantime, Smithson died in an air crash accident in 1973. And note that there is a single photograph that documents the original installation. That is all that is left of the original installation in 1969. In this case, not only the material element is not the same as in the work original iteration, but the very act of creative artistic creation is an imitation. In a review of the 1997 recreation published on Frieze, a critic called it, and I quote, a hologram, or better, a talisman, a mystical object stirring the faint hope that the great man, meaning the artist, may just reappear. The Remade Smithson work thus acts as a fetish, and not in the Marxian sense of an alluring market commodity, but in anthropological sense of an object that conveys an invisible supranatural presence. This is the reiteration in Oslo. Now I move to discuss, finally, Walter Benjamin, for whom an unbridgeable distance separates the work of art from its viewer, regardless of their physical position. Benjamin called this distance the aura. But this term was used by 19th century physiologists for a breathing gasp, and some commentators have suggested that Benjamin used it as a misnomer for the aesthetic phenomenon it theorized. According to Benjamin, aura is the mark of the artwork embeddedness in the context of tradition, that is to say, of the work origins in religious cult. Benjamin's central thesis is that even though the work of art has in principle always been reproducible, analogical technologies like photography and cinematography pose a mortal threat to the work's aura. Now, be clear, Benjamin welcomed this outcome for promoting, and these are his words, the emancipation of the work of art from its parasitic subservience to ritual. Photography was, after all, the contemporary of socialism. But while extolling the liberating virtues of reproduction technologies, Benjamin also acknowledged that, and this is again a quote, cult value does not give way without resistance. Already in the 19th and early 20th century, before Benjamin wrote his famous essay on the work of art in the age of technological replication in the mid-30s, chromolithographic prints of religious imagery were popular for domestic worship in places as different as India and North America. The Indian case has been studied in a wonderful book by Christopher Pinning called Photos of the Gods. The dissemination of these prints did not erode the aura of original icons, but rather spread their presence outside the temple and the church much more broadly than woodblock prints and engraving had done in previous centuries. The endurance of the work of art primal cult value is a Benjamin expression, was reaffirmed by Hans-Georg Gadamer in his 1963 treatise Truth and Method, which is a masterpiece of hermeneutical theory. Gadamer writes that an ancient image of the gods that was displayed in a temple not as a work of art in order to give aesthetic pleasure, and is now on show in a museum, retains, even as he stands before us today, the word of a religious experience from which he came. And then later in the book, in discussing the nature of the image or picture, and note that in German there is one word for both of these, which is Bild, Gadamer makes an even more radical assertion. Only the religious image displays the full ontological power of the image. In it we can see that the image, or a picture, Bild, is not a copy of a copied being, but it's in ontological communion with what is copied. End of the quote. And now I draw a bit on my expertise in Thai art to draw some analogies. Its theological stories about Buddhist as well as Christian icons exemplifies Gadamer's argument. According to a story transmitted by both the Theravada and Mahayana tradition, the first image of the Buddha was allegedly made on the order of King Udayana or Prasenajit, depending on the version. And it was made by 32 artisans, each tasked with replicating one of the Buddha Sakyamuni's unique somatic traits. Once completed, the image is said to have walked to greet the Buddha on his return from the heavens, as a veritable doppelganger. For some Japanese Buddhists, the wood image housed in the Seiryoji temple in Kyoto, imported from China at the end of the 10th century, is the Udayana image, or at the very least, a close copy of it. The entrails made of cloth that were found inside this image, along with the most typical relics and votive objects, underscore its true-to-life nature. Luke the Evangelist is likewise believed to have drawn from life the first portrait of Mary. This original portrait was long considered to be the Byzantine icon that is today displayed in the Cathedral of Santa Maria Maggiore in Rome. The first image of Christ, instead, is the so-called Veronica, that is to say, in Latin, a vera icona, meaning the truth icon. And it was qualified in Greek language as an akeiropoieton, that literally means not made by human hands, hence having a numinous origin. Preserved as a relic in St. Peter's Basilica, the Veronica is the alleged impression of Christ's face made on the cloth with which the eponymous saint wiped his face on Mount Calvary. And this is a famous painting by the 15th German painter Hans Memling that shows Veronica, Saint Veronica, holding the cloth. Circulation is recorded in the Byzantine Empire of another such akeiropoieton imprinted with Christ likeness, called the Mandylion, that allegedly vanished during the First Crusade. Now, I must mention in passing that image worship in both Buddhist and Christian devotion supervene relic worship. including both the mortal remains of the Buddha and early Christian martyrs and saints, and relics, the so-called relics of contact, like the Veronica itself, or, for Buddhists, the Bodhi tree at Bodh Gaya, under which the Buddha allegedly had his illumination. And a branch of this tree was allegedly donated by Emperor Asoka to the Sinhalese king for replanting in Anuradharupa, in this way duplicating the original contact relic. So what I'm suggesting is the relic, not only they precede cult images, but they also set the model for the replication of cult images. Now, all these legends of origins concern a primal or super image, an Urbild, we may say in German, forged directly on the prototype and sharing in or acquiring the properties of it by virtue of what James Fraser would have called sympathetic magic. James Fraser is one of the founding figures of anthropology. The Urbild is, in turn, and I quote this short sentence, the fist of a multitude, as stated in a Chinese narrative of the Udayana image. In the eyes of believers, every Buddha image is a substitute of the Buddha, and so is every image of Christ and Mary. It's in this sense that in a recent study, Sheng Sui-man speaks of authentic replicas. As argued by Shen, and I quote, the original is always an event, not an object. Any object is already secondary to the originating event of divine manifestation. In other words, the original is an epiphany that can be replayed innumerable times. This understanding is illustrated by Hiroshi Sugimoto's photographic portrait of the army of life-size wood statue of Kannon, or Bodhisattva, that flanked the main resident image of Sanju Sangando in Kyoto. Most of these 1,000 statues were remade after the temple caught fire in 1249, less than a century after its inauguration, and they were remade taking advantage of the new joint wood technique, or yosegi, that afforded the standardization of image making. Now, quite apart from the doctrinal or theological meanings conveyed by a multitude of sacred images, as in this case, wrong image, sorry. Quite apart from the doctrinal or theological meanings conveyed by a multitude of images, their proliferation is taken by scholars of both Western and Asian religious art to have promoted the dissemination of associated cults and belief, and to have concurrently propagated the aura of the Urbild as the origin of the replication chain. It's no surprise that theologians were tasked, even before art connoisseurs and curators, with establishing the distinction of prototype from copy. And Sheng Sui-man, in her book, also considered the printing of sutras in medieval China as a form of votive replication, and I will come back to this point. Tai and Lao chronicles that narrate the peregrination and tribulation of famous Buddha images imply that the original were furtively substituted by copies at critical times. After all, as Hiller Schwartz says, an object uncopied is under perpetual siege. This chronicle tells us that to trick rulers and robbers alike, copies needed not be identical to the authoritative icon that stood for, but they needed to reproduce its essential features in order to have the same efficacy. As a result, original copy were sometimes mixed up in the eyes of believers. This is the case of the Praputta Singh of the Singhala Buddha, because he was believed to have come from Sri Lanka. His identity is shared by 3 images, the most trusted one, this one, having resided in a Chiang Mai temple since 1389. What the formalist art historian sees as stylistic connection, the devout see as a lineage of sanctity. Alexander Giswold a World War II spy who later became the first American scholar and collector of Thai sculpture, repeatedly made the following point, and I quote, "The copy doesn't have to look like the model. He has to be like it. Has been successive editions of a book with the same text, the format may change." End quote. Now, this comment applies to Buddhist images, but just as well to Buddhist reliquaries. Griswold echoed the theory articulated in those same years by Nelson Goodman in his very influential treatise, Languages of Art, that was first published in 1968, and was inspired by the trial of the notorious Dutch art forgers Han van Meegeren. Okay, I believe there is a Netflix film, recent one, on this character. Goodman distinguishes between what he calls autographic arts, meaning art that can be falsified, like painting and sculpture, and allographic arts, like poetry and music, that cannot be falsified. In the first case, even the most exact duplication doesn't count as genuine. Works of literature and music, instead, may have multiple instantiations that, as long as they correctly reproduce the work-written text or notational score, need not be the composer's autograph to qualify as genuine. And yet, based on Griswold and Shen's argument and contra Goodman, Buddhist culture and architecture, and indeed most religious art, think of Orthodox icons, for instance, can be qualified as replicable or allographic, just like sacred scriptures. And this is Shen's point. Given that a copy is equivalent to the original, provided that, 1, it's iconographically correct, that is to say, it contains all the essential features of its type, and 2, proves itself by miraculous feats to possess the same authority or charisma of the original image. Now, the transfer of authority from original to copy is effected through consecration, or, to use a more prickly term, animation. And Griswold describes a ritual that was still taking place in Thailand, in northern Thailand in the 70s, by which a monastery's main resident image, which substitutes for the Buddha, is tied with a rope to a new image awaiting consecration. So the rope acts as a cable channeling the former energy into the copy. This energy is often referred to by a Sanskrit term, Sakti, which is more or less the same equivalent of the Greek energeia, if you read the classical authors. Now, the transmission of animating energy makes the copy into a double, as implied by the Chinese term for idol, which is Hou Xiang, literally the image of the double. According to the late semiotician Umberto Eco, and I quote, "A double is not identical in the sense of indiscernibility with its twin. Nevertheless, they are considered to be interchangeable, insofar as both possess the essential attributes prescribed by an abstract type." All right, let me sum up this lengthy discussion into a third proposition before I move towards the conclusion. Effective substitution in the case of votive art, and often also in the case of modernist art, requires not aesthetic sameness with the original, but ontological identity with it, with the primal image, Urbild, being itself but the copy of the divine prototype. Copies of an authoritative work, whether authorized or not, are interchangeable with the latter as long as they share its essential attributes, even if they are not indiscernible from it. Now, the chromolithograph that I showed you earlier tend to be dismissed as religious kitsch, but this is not the case with the icons of American pop culture replicated through serigraphy by Andy Warhol in the 1960s and 70s. Warhol's silkscreen series, like that of Marilyn, which notes was produced beginning in 1962 when the actress died, has seen by Jennifer Dyer to, open quote, continue and rework a tradition of Christian iconography that gives Warhol's serigraphic prints the ex nihilo effect of the holy face icon. They appear to be self-generating, atemporal, and otherworldly, without beginning or end, and like icons are produced in a large number and to a pattern. We may add to this observation the consecration of icons and authentication of Warhol's silkscreen each requires validation by ecclesiastical institutions and the art world, respectively. Today, there are many foundations established in the name of 20th century artists, either already dead or fairly old. And these foundations are primarily designed to authenticate original works by distinguishing them from forgery. And it's well known that there are in circulation many forged Warhol silkscreens. That is to say, unauthorized copies of the artist's own unacknowledged serial copies of mass-mediated images. So you can see there is a chain of replication of the copy, copy after copy after copy. As a reaction to the danger posed by mechanical replication to the original work's aura, the institution of the museum pursued throughout the 20th century the canonization as works of art of an increasingly wide array of cultural objects, not only modernist ready-made, but also products of industrial design and even tribal artifacts. Now, note that the term canonization belongs in the vocabulary of art history and criticism as much as in that of ecclesiastical law, where it defines the legal proceeding that leads to the proclamation of a departed person as a saint. The equivalence of temple and museum and religious cult and the cult of art is a commonplace in the museological literature. The late anthropologist Alfred Goell, in his landmark book Art and Agency, posits art as a substitute for religion. Another anthropologist, Charles Lindholm, wrote some 20 years ago that, like medieval priests, curators are also concerned to demonstrate that the objects they have accumulated are originals, not forgeries, and therefore truly worth of devotion. End quote. And yet, as David Scott has argued more recently, and again I quote, forgeries may lie about their origins, but they may not tell a lie about their presence if the aura of their existence is accepted by generations of museum visitors as something tangible and real. The advent at the last turn of the century of digital replication, which has made redundant physical support to electronic images, and the now incumbent age of artificial intelligence, with its capacity not only to replicate art, but to generate artworks, visually as well as literary, poses, of course, novel challenges and perhaps opportunities. Over the past decade, digital museology and virtual heritage conservation have emerged as new fields. Technologies such as digital imaging, laser scanning, and 2D and 3D augmented reality have been used to great effect. For example, to produce an immersive virtual facsimile of the Mogao Grotto's Buddhist rock painting, or to recreate, hypothetically, the original chromatic aspect of the Arapachi's high relief, along with the lost portions of the relief. Arapachi's is in Rome, is the temple built for Augustus. These exciting initiatives raise, however, an uncomfortable question. Will works of art become irrelevant, perhaps even invisible, under the ever-expanding multitude of replicas and simulacra, as already decried in the 1980s by Eco and Baudrillard? Factum Arte is a Madrid-based company that has achieved fame for its high-definition facsimiles of artwork, such as the facsimile of Mannerist master Paolo Veronese's monumental old painting, The Wedding at Cana, whose original, this one, is exhibited in the Louvre. The facsimile was unveiled in its original location the refectory of the Benedictine Abbey on the Venetian island of San Giorgio, on 11th of September 2007, exactly 210 years to the day from his seizure by Napoleon as war booty. Because of the damages and heavy restoration suffered by the original painting, Factum Arte founder Adam Louvre claimed the facsimile to be more original than the extant painting. And in 2019 interview on CBS, he went as far as saying verbatim, the Factum Arte is trying to redefine the relationship between originality and authenticity. Now, as bona fide copies, the Factum Arte facsimile do not attempt to usurp the identity of the original work, as forgeries do. But in cases where the work has undergone significant alteration and relocations, as in this case, the facsimile may showcase better than the extant original what Dennis Dutton calls a work's expressive authenticity, as distinct from its nominal authenticity. The test of expressive authenticity is emotional response. So we go back to emotions. And you can watch a video on YouTube on the unveiling of the replica to public acclaim. It's admittedly ironic, however, that, as pointed out by Rosalind Krauss, the massive output of works produced by the Paolo Veronese workshop, even long after his death, cast doubts, and I quote, on his physical and conceptual singularity as the origins of author of his own work. So, if Factum Arte is trying to redefine originality, how original is this work, let alone the facsimile? I'm almost there. There is a second irony. Despite the limitless reproducibility afforded by digital technology, Factum Arte facsimiles are unique pieces. This is especially ironic given the argument put forth by Louvre and the epistemological star Bruno Latour in a co-written paper that, I quote, a work of art grows in originality in proportion to the quality and abundance of its copies. But then they make only single copies. Of course, the cost involved in the lengthy process of replication, which is artisanal as much as high-tech, is considerable and is usually undertaken on the order of an institutional client, as in this case. But in my opinion, there is also another reason that I present as my final proposition. A copy that shares the aura of the original must perforce also redouble the fetishism of the original in a fetishism of the copy. And this time I mean it in a Marxian sense, that sees its origins in the peculiar social character of the labor that produces commodities, in Marx's words. This is why the copy, as much as the original work of art, belongs both in the temple as the animated icon and in the museum as the mystical commodity. Both the temple and the museum temporarily remove the object from the economic sphere of exchange. But this removal can always be reversed, as the icon is desecrated and the museum object is de-accessioned and sold. Not even goddesses may be spared this uncertainty. And so to sum up, like yin and yang, original and copy define one another mutually and circularly, each containing an element of its opposite. There is a fair bit or a lot of the original in the copy, but there is also always a potential copy that inheres in the original. And this is the way of art. Thank you.
Thank you, Maurizio, for that recondite presentation. I won't dare to propose a summary, lest I commit the heresy of a paraphrase. But I have some questions for you. I think hopefully these questions will open up the interest from the audience to ask their own. Maybe just two questions, Maurizio. You've been working on the modernity of the Thai image over time. I was a long time ago. I know this was in a previous incarnation as a scholar, but I was wondering if that long-term engagement with Thai modernity had informed some of your like seminal thoughts on this new concern of yours of the image, the copy, and the remade, right? So I'm just trying to, you know, yeah, and like as a life, the life of a scholar, how does that, you know, how would you
What is
describe the movement?
What is the trajectory? No, this really is a new interest that I developed in the past 5 or 6 years, and is the direct product of the book I published in 2017, in which for the first time I took up the study of Buddhist art. So in fact, it's not about studying, it doesn't come from studying Thai modernity, but rather from studying Thai art through the new critical lenses of anthropology, modern art history. So this all concerned with the sacrality of work and how sacrality exists not only in a religious context, but also in the context of going to museums and going to galleries, and the same kind of awe and respect and submission, in a sense, that we feel towards, you know, art, faith, or art that, as I say, Alfred Gell says, is a modern religion. So let's say that it's this new line of research, of which my book on devotional conservation is also part, comes from this fairly new for me, interest in Buddhist art, more than on Thai modernity. But assuming here that the historical or let's say chronological concern is not prominent in what I'm doing right now. I'm rather looking into you know, consistent paradigms of interpretation, circulation, and so forth.
Thank you. My other question, Maurizio, has something to do with like theory of art, and I think you briefly mentioned that, and maybe I'd like to pick up on what you've proposed about the theory of art. I was wondering, in light of your reflection on imitation or the double and the remake, I was just wondering what happens to the category of the artwork. As an art historian, I'm interested in how your reflection on the some kind of supplement or afterlife of the original transforms our very notion of the artwork. So after this lecture, for instance, how would the art historian, how should the art historian look at art?
As they did before. I mean, no, out of joke. Well, first of all, you see the parallel that I close with between Candadas and the Venus of Rags, right? And the way in which there is an element, we can say a kind of primordial element of humans' approach to the making of art that survives in the contemporary. And I think that I was kind of suggesting in the talk, but I didn't have the time to develop this point, that I mentioned Belting's ideas of the era before art, right? And Belting takes a very Eurocentric point, because eventually art is said to begin with the Renaissance. So naturalism naturalistic representation that moves away from the iconic. And we may discuss this, whether this is actually an interesting point. I don't think it's terribly interesting. But what is interesting is that with modernism, as we all know, artists go back to the pre-modern. Right? So modernism from the use of the African masks, and we see this very clearly, of course, in Asian modernism or Latin American modernism. There was a beautiful exhibition that you presented here a few months ago. How the pre-modern element, meaning the culturally primordial element, survives through the phase of representational art and comes back as an afterlife in modernism. So I guess that the only suggestion I can make to the art historian to take away is don't think that modern art begins in, I don't know, when you want to make it, when it's modern in the sense of modernist art. When do we make it to begin? Because as you know, there are no dates for this. You can make different claims, but
Late Gothic.
that's modern art. But the modernist one, yes, it's Monet. It's Impressionism, is the avant-gardes. I think that I chose Duchamp because Duchamp really sets the stage for conceptual art that is not about what is represented, but the idea what is represented. And religious art is precisely this. It's not about a realistic, credible image of the Buddha, of Christ, or Mary. Is conveying their presence. So I think that, and again, I didn't have the time to develop this point today, but there is an analogy, or maybe analogy is too much. There is a parallel between pre-modern art, or we can say with belting art before the era of art, and modernism. The point, of course, is modernism is by now also an historic moment in the development of art history. So the art historians will know better than me what to do with that.
In that case, Maurizio, if it's before the era of art, what would be the method of the art historian?
Well, this is the answer for this. I'm clear. The method is the method of the anthropologist.
Oh, okay.
That's why some of the most interesting work done in art history in the past 20 years is done by anthropologists, not by art historians, or by art historians like Belting, who are very conversant with cultural anthropology. I mean, Alfred Gale is Art and Agency is a perfect example of that. Not to discount the art historians. I'm not an anthropologist, so I don't have a vested interest in this argument.
Or Abbie
But
Warburg.
that's my opinion.
Yeah, I think on that not so optimistic note for art historians.
No, but it's not negative either.
Yeah,
I
it
mean,
is.
It's a call for art historians to broaden the scope of their readings and their methodological toolbox.
And I think that's also the basis of Belting's claim of the end of art history.
That's right.
Okay, so
Which is an old claim because it comes from Hegel originally, of course. I mean, it's in the same way that the era before art is a rephrasing of Benjamin cult value versus exhibition value. I mean, there is a lot that Belting leaves, there is a lot that Belting takes for granted, but we can see how this idea survives in his writings.
So thank you, Maurizio. I think we're ready for questions.
Yeah, you were ready.
Or,
Yes.
so if you have one, please. Yes, Eugene.
Thank you, Maurizio, for that very thought-provoking lecture. You've been talking very much about objects as artworks. But in recent years, we've also seen a lot of performances, live art, recreated. Can you say something about that? Of course, with performance art, there was also the specific context in which it was first created and experienced.
Thank you for the question, because it allows me to say something that I sideline in the talk. And I think that it's in performance art that we see even more strongly than in traditional material artworks this analogy with cult and ritual. I mean, here, in this case, the analogy is very evident. I mean, a ritual is a performance, and performance art is a kind of ritual. And so in this sense, I know too little about performance art to venture into making any kind of claim of arguments. But in a sense, I think that this argument may work even better. I mean, it may come across, because this idea that of the authentic replica, right? Of the epiphany, the manifestation of the God can be repeated every time. Epiphany is indeed a performance. In fact, cult ritual ritual is the representation of an epiphany through sacrifice or whatever are the means of the ritual. So here, and again, I mean, it builds onto the argument I propose that there is a very strong parallel between pre-modern or art or era or art before the art and modernist art. And by the way, performance art is really part of this history of late modernism, because with postmodernist art, we see very much a return to the object. Performance loses somehow the importance that it has from the 60s and the 70s, where performance art is really, a major, becomes a major art form. So again, I mean, I think this actually reinforces my argument. There is a very strong parallel between religious pre-modern art and modernist art, from Duchamp all the way to performance art of the 70s.
Hi, thanks again for the talk. So I couldn't help but read this maybe through, I don't know if you're familiar with the philosopher Byung-Chul Han's argument around Shanzai culture, which I guess applies more primarily to designed objects, but as a brief summary, I think he comes to the conclusion that this sort of copying represents a sort of political potential that's inherent in the process. But with I guess the relationship maybe would be between forgery and the authorized facsimile like you presented in conclusion. And I wonder if that kind of recuperation negates any political potential that existed in the forgery or in the Shanzai object.
Sorry, political in what sense?
Well, I think that this is comes from a process of, I guess, like Benjamin's pro-socialist replication of the photograph, but in this case, it's a similar replication of the object, the designed object that would otherwise be, I guess.
So it's political in the sense that it's liberating. There is an emancipatory process.
Right. But that, I guess,
or democratizing process.
Yeah, so I'm just wondering if an authorization by the owner of the copyright, for example, in this case, the Louvre Museum, negates potentially that potential.
I'm not the right person I'm sorry, I'm not the right person to answer this. What I can tell you is the factum arte, in order to conduct the rather time-consuming 3D scanning of Veronese, needed, of course, the permission of the Louvre Museum, and the scanning was conducted at night when the museum was closed. So, in other words, the Louvre as an institution authorized the process that led to the fabrication of the facsimile. Now, I don't think we're dealing with a political process here, but certainly it has to do with institutions and their power to determine or to limit or to permit certain kind of operations. And in a sense, there is a way in which replication may, and I stress, may become an instrument of, to an extent, a political instrument. In the way, for instance, in which, like in the Veronese painting, I mean, this is a piece of war booty. And Italian art has been looted for centuries by everybody else. I hate nationalism, but this is a point that I want to make very clear. There are European nations that have suffered the same fate as non-European nations when it comes to their cultural heritage. So what is the claim here? Is that we put the facsimile back in the place where it belongs, because the institution will not return that. So this is a political act. Now, as you know, about 20 years ago, a museum of the Acropolis was built in Athens to host the Elgin marbles that Greece has been forever trying to get back from the British Museum. And the museum is fundamentally empty there to make this political statement. What belongs here is not here. Now, digital replication affords the possibility of making up for that. But then, of course, will it be the same thing? Will the aura of the replica stand up for the aura of the original? I don't have the answer, I'm sorry. I mean, I don't have the answer to this last question that I formulated.
Thank you for the excellent talk. Just recently, I saw the commissioned works, I think, of Murakami, doing exactly what you're talking about. There was an exhibition of the original 100 views of Ido by Hiroshige, and they'd asked, I think, Murakami to make a few, but he replicated all 100 plus several others. In some, he changed the scale. In some, he added his iconic flowers and faces and different things. And so I was also wondering about the question. So here you have wood works, ukiyo-e wood block prints, which are now done through screen printing. And amazing, both of them. So what is original and what is a copy? What is a replica? So it raises a very interesting question as well. So to your point,
do you have your own answer to this question?
I looked at it and I thought, okay, it's interesting. Both are original in some ways. Yes? And yet, you have replicas.
She was the art historian. Are both originals on their own terms?
I think they're interchangeable.
So there you go. So my question was, because it's been authorized by a museum, the Brooklyn Art Museum, it has validity. What if somebody else had done it and had it not been Murakami? What would we talk about then? Okay,
this is indeed this question has a political nature, as our friend also just suggested. I mean, there are two sides to my argument. One which I mentioned briefly, which is Marx's idea of commodity fetishism. We should not forget everything is produced in an historical, social, and economic context. And we can never fully grasp its meaning if we forget about the context, unless you are a formalist art historian, which you are not. And then there is the political side that I didn't deal with, but clearly replication has always raised that issue. Benjamin argument, in fact, about the welcoming of the destruction of the aura is presented in the context of a very fierce criticism of fascist appropriation of art that Benjamin saw taking place in the 1930s. If I hear the name Murakami, I will think that money matters much more than politics in this case, but my opinion. In my opinion.
One more question? Yeah, one more question. Maybe, yeah. I don't know.
These LED lights.
I know.
Blinding.
Thank you, Professor. So would you say that internet memes and online art are the culmination or the latest evolution in the history of the copy and the remaking?
Yes, they are.
What about the ethics involved in that?
Well, again, I'm not the right person to answer this question. The Murakami example makes this point very clear. I mean, one thing is Pistoletto remaking his own work, or Supancat, and one question is a living artist appropriating the work of a dead artist, in the case of Hiroshige, dead for several hundred years, of course with authorization of the museums, the olds, the originals. So in a sense, you can never get away from the question of the original. Because however long the chain of replication, you always go back to that. If the original is defined as a performance, then, or as Goodman will have as an holographic art, then you know that every copy of War and Peace is the true copy, provided that all the words, all the letters, and the punctuations follows the original text. The same goes for, of course, for music recordings. And this was the argument made by Goodman in the 60s. I'm not terribly interested, I must confess, I'm sorry, I'm not terribly interested in digital technology. I find it rather annoying in a sense. But this may just be due to my aging age. But yes, I mean, again, to go back to your question, yes, it is the latest frontier, and as every new frontier in history, he is a continuation of a process, and but at the same time poses new challenges and new problems, and maybe new opportunities, as I said. So, for instance, if you go on the website of the Arapaches, where I fish out this photograph on the screening of the colors, nobody has seen these colors in 2,000 years. So, of course, the archaeologists and the curators explain with great care that this coloration is based on archaeological hypotheses that take into consideration this and that and that. But in the end, it's it's fundamentally what Baudrillard called a simulacrum. It's the image of an original that doesn't exist. And I guess we have just to trust the institutions or the singular artist that does that in order to buy into how truthful to reality is the reproduction. There is also a huge amount of economic interest involved in these things, and this should never be forgotten.
Thank you.
Patrick, I think we have one more question from the front. We'll take that.
Okay. Thank you, Professor. I've been thinking a lot about how you ended your lecture, that the doubling of aura requires the doubling of the fetish. I'm thinking about alienation as connected to the Marxist idea of commodity fetishism. And I'm wondering whether the way in which you theorize the copy of an art object is perhaps an analog of delegation in performance or translation in literature. So here we always have the historical and the cultural context of the circulation, whether for economic market reasons or for the ways in which we wish to democratize or to return or repatriate. I wonder whether along the lines of alienation, or rather the suspension of alienation between the producer and the consumer, we're able to get closer to how we can re-theorize the aura in the contemporary. Here I'm also thinking about Agamben and profanations. So you were talking about the cult in answer to the first question, and I'm thinking about how rituals and cult, the two concepts, actually offer a way out of the kind of binary of the sacred and the profane and such, which, as you are familiar with.
Can you repeat the point? They offer a way out of the binary?
Of the binary between the sacred and the profane, such that the cult, or what that word signifies, could expand to include the fetish as an open-ended way.
Well, Agamben makes exactly this kind of argument in his reading of Benjamin. But Agamben is... Agamben take on things is always extremely, how should I say? I can't find, I can't recall the English word now, but let's say extremely negative. There is no hope in Agamben reading of anything. Pessimistic, yes, worse than that, in fact. I mean, there is even a higher degree of pessimism. Well, you will need someone as smart as Agamben to answer that. I'm not. I'm sorry to disappoint you. But I was reading, there is in Profanations, which is a collection of Agamben essay. It talks about one of Benjamin's latest fragments, Capitalism as a Religion. And obviously there is something to say there. You also mentioned translation at one point. Okay, translation I think it's very interesting because in a book by two art historians who study the sacred image in medieval and early modern Italian art, they precisely make this point that replication is akin to translation in a sense. The replication of the sacred image is akin to translation. And they draw on Benjamin on this because it's never the same that is produced, but it's always a reinterpreted versions of the original. Now, how does all this ties to a kind of liberating impulse? I think this is what your question is driving to, right? Well, if I were a religious person, I will say to embrace religion, but I'm not. So I get to embrace religious images. So I cannot give you that answer. But certainly there is something that I think there are very interesting lessons, at least, that we can draw from studying religious images. Because it's true, these religious images are also produced for a market. They are eventually produced for people who buy them for personal devotions. They are bought by institutions like the church or the Buddhist Sangha. So there is always an economic context to, as I was saying, to any image production. But at the same time, these religious images live of a kind of duality, of if you wish, the duality of belonging to this world, and so belonging to economy and politics, and also to transcending this world. Many artists, throughout the history of art, we can see artists again and again trying to assert this. That's the art is a way of transcending the the present, the context, the contingent. Art is a transcendence of contingency. But this very idea actually comes from religious art and is again reappropriated, especially in the age of modernism, when the necessity of naturalistic representation becomes less important. This is again drawn largely from the perspective of European art history. If we try to fit this context in the context of the history of Chinese art, I guess that our considerations may change considerably. An interpretation of your question, not an answer, and I'm aware of that.
But Maurizio, the fetish for the copy, that's how you ended also, right? The fetish for the copy is also quite interesting. And that, for me, tends to be a neoliberal argument. You think, is there a way out of that?
Neoliberal in the sense that it's closely tied to...
Yet unregulated use, right?
Well, I guess that to go back to some of the questions, when this process takes place within, or the other question, when the replication takes place within the framework dictated by, the transnational cultural industry, like Google Arts, just to name names, then yes, it's part of this, what we can say. I think what has been happening in the world in the past, 6 months has moved us far beyond the neoliberal. We are literally into the neo-imperialist once again. So I don't know how useful it is to keep talking about the neoliberal at this point in our time, terrible times that we are living. Honestly, but the replication of the cult image points precisely to a different possibility: the metaphysical versus the contingent and the economic.
So that's the progressive argument, no? Could be.
That's Pope Francis' argument, I guess.
Yeah.
Then again, I'm not a believer myself, so but I will say he will be happy to hear that.
Or that's the Catholic argument. Okay. So I think on that note.
And you are Filipino, I'm Italian, so
Okay.
we are happy with that. We can close with that.
Yeah, that's a good.
Thank you, professors. Can everybody join me in thanking Professor Peleggi and Patrick for the wonderful lecture and conversation?